The rifle was cold in Margaret Ramsay's hands, though the July sun had been beating down on Split Pass Station since before dawn, and everything else in the Montana Territory seemed to be burning to the touch. She had the hammer back, and the sight leveled on the chest of a man she had never met before that morning, a tall stagecoach driver climbing down from his box with the easy, unhurried motion of someone who did not yet understand how close he stood to dying. "Stand where you are," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands wanted to. Cornelius Archer stopped with one boot still on the wheel hub of his coach, dust rising around him in a slow gold curtain, and looked at the rifle, and then at the woman holding it, and something in his face went very still and very careful, the way a man's face goes when he has learned that sudden movements around loaded weapons rarely end well for anyone. "I do not know you, ma'am," he said. "But I would take it as a kindness if you would tell me why you are pointing my own father's old habit of getting shot at square at my heart. You are the one they call Cornelius Archer." "I am." "You drove the stage through Ashcroft Pass 3 weeks back, the 19th of June. "I drove that stage through Ashcroft Pass most every week since the snow melted, ma'am. You will have to be more particular." Around them, the station yard had gone quiet in that particular way. A crowd goes quiet when it senses blood might soon be spilled and does not want to miss it. A dozen travelers, freighters, and idle hands paused at the trough, and the porch rail of the low log building that served as trading post, way station, and the only law for 40 miles in any direction. Hiram Boyle, who kept the station, had come as far as the doorway with a coffee pot still in his hand, and did not set it down, as though the pot might be useful either as a weapon or as an excuse to stay out of what was plainly none of his business. Margaret's arms ached from 4 days in the saddle behind a string of 9 horses, and grief had worn a groove down the center of her so deep that she scarcely recognized the sound of her own voice anymore, but she made herself say it plain, because plain was the only way she had left to say anything. "My husband was Thomas Ramsay. We were bound from Missouri with our horses and our claim papers for land along Silver Creek, above the flats, below your pass. A man at that trading post yonder told me not an hour ago that it was you who let it be known, to men who did not deserve to know it, exactly what my husband was carrying, and exactly what day and hour he would be riding that grade alone. He told me you took your silver for its same as any man takes his weight." Something moved behind Cornelius Archer's eyes then, not fear, but a kind of weary recognition, as though he had been waiting for this particular blow to fall from some direction or another, and was almost relieved it had finally landed so he could see its shape. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I do not know who told you that, but I will tell you plain that it is a lie, and I will tell you something else besides, which is that I have not slept a full night since I heard what happened to your husband, because I was meant to be riding escort on that stretch myself that week, and a busted axle kept me here at this station 2 days longer than I planned, and so he rode it alone when he should not have had to." Margaret's finger did not leave the trigger guard. "That is a fine story for a man caught holding the smoking end of a lie." "It is not a story. Ask Hiram Boyle standing right there in that doorway, who watched me curse that axle for 2 whole days while good men rode past me toward trouble I could not follow into." Hiram Boyle cleared his throat, plainly wishing he had stayed inside. "It is true enough, Mrs. Ramsay. He was stuck here. I will swear to it on whatever book you like." The rifle wavered, not because Margaret believed him yet, but because the certainty she had carried up the trail like a stone in her chest had suddenly developed a crack, and she did not know what to do with a grief that had lost its target. She had wanted, these 3 weeks, one clear thing to hate. It had kept her upright on the trail when nothing else could have. "Who told you it was me?" Cornelius asked, and there was no anger in it, only a kind of tired attention, the look of a man filing away a fact he intended to use later. A thin fellow with a scar through one eyebrow at the trading post window not an hour past said his name was Skinner. Cornelius's jaw tightened at that name in a way that told Margaret more than any denial could have. "Ezra Skinner rides for Sela's vein," he said. "And Sela's vein has wanted that stretch of the pass road, and every acre of grass and water below it, since before your husband ever pointed a wagon tongue toward it." For a long moment nobody in the yard moved. The heat pressed down on all of them alike, rich men and poor, guilty and innocent, and somewhere behind the station, a dog barked twice at nothing, and then gave it up as too much effort in such weather. Margaret lowered the rifle at last, not all the way, but enough that its muzzle pointed at the dust between them instead of at a man's heart. And in that small mercy Cornelius Archer felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since the day he had heard, second-hand and too late, that a settler named Ramsey had been found dead on the grade with his horses scattered, and his wife somewhere behind him on the trail, alive, and now, apparently, alone. "I buried my husband 4 days back," Margaret said, and her voice cracked for the first time, though her spine did not bend an inch. "I mean to finish what he started. I have his horses to deliver and his land to claim, and I do not have time, Mr. Archer, to spend it aiming guns at men who did not do what I was told they did." "Then you have wasted none of it," Cornelius said, "because I mean to help you find the man who did." Hiram Boyle finally set down his coffee pot, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the whole business started. "Well," he said, to no one in particular, "that is the first sensible thing said in this yard all morning." Margaret Ramsey did not lower the rifle further, not yet, but she did not raise it again either, and in the space of that stillness, under a sun that showed no mercy to any living thing in the territory that summer, something between her and Cornelius Archer began, though neither of them would have called it by any name so soft as that for a good while yet. The grave lay a day's ride south of the station, marked only by a wooden cross Margaret had lashed together from 2 barrel staves, and a strip of harness leather, planted in a low rise where the grass had not yet had time to grow back over the raw earth. She rode there alone the next morning, refusing Cornelius Archer's offer to accompany her, not out of continued suspicion, but because some things a woman needed to do without an audience, however well meant. She carried Thomas's rifle across her saddle the whole way, the same one she had held on Cornelius the day before, an old percussion conversion Springfield that Thomas had carried since before their marriage, and had cleaned every Sunday evening of their life together with the same patient care he gave to mending harness or reading scripture aloud in his low, unhurried voice. It had not fired the shot that killed him. He had not even had time to lift it from the wagon box before the men who ambushed him were already close enough that reaching for it would have gotten him killed faster, not slower. She had found it still lashed under the seat when she came upon the wreck of the wagon 2 days after, the horses scattered and grazing loose in the coulee grass, as though nothing at all had happened to the man who raised them from foals. She knelt at the grave a long while, not praying exactly, because she had run out of prayers somewhere on the trail between Missouri and this hard yellow country, but talking, the way she had talked to Thomas every evening of their marriage, telling him about the horses, about the station, about the strange stagecoach driver who claimed innocence with such quiet certainty that she had almost believed him before he ever offered a single proof. "I am going to bury this with you," she said at last, laying the rifle down along the raw earth beside the cross. "You never had cause to use it in anger your whole life, and I do not aim to carry it into whatever is coming for me either. I have my own hands, Thomas, and I have your papers, and I mean to finish what we started, but I will finish it as myself, not as a woman haunted by your gun." She dug the grave a second time, only shallow, only enough to lay the rifle along his resting place and cover it over with the same red-brown earth. And when she stood again her knees ached and her eyes were dry, because she had wept everything she had to weep on the 4 days coming up from the ambush site, and what was left in her now was something harder and more useful than grief. She mounted her horse, looked once more at the small rise with its crooked cross, and turned north, toward the land Thomas Ramsay had crossed a continent to see and never would. She found Cornelius Archer waiting for her at the fork where the grave trail met the pass road, not because he had followed her, he was careful to explain, but because his stage was not due out until the following morning, and a man could sit a horse at a crossroads thinking his own thoughts without it meaning anything in particular. Margaret did not entirely believe him, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not much mind the lie if it was one. "You buried it," he said, nodding at her rifle-less saddle. "I did. Most folks around here would tell you that is a foolish thing to do, riding into country with claim jumpers and land-hungry men, and no rifle to your name. Most folks around here have not buried a husband who never got to see the land he crossed a continent for," Margaret said. "I do not aim to be told what is foolish by most folks." Something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of Cornelius Archer's mouth, quickly suppressed, as though he had caught himself admiring something he had not yet earned the right to admire. "No, ma'am," he said. "I do not suppose you do." They rode together as far as the fork toward Silver Creek before either of them spoke again, and it was Cornelius who broke the silence, turning in his saddle to study her with an openness that surprised them both. "I mean to tell you something, Mrs. Ramsay, and I would ask you to hear the whole of it before you decide what to do with it." "Go on." "Sela's vein has been buying up half-dead claims on the flats below Prairie Wells all this dry summer, quiet-like, through men who do not carry his name on the paper. Farmers who cannot dig deep enough to reach water before their wells give out are selling to him for pennies rather than watch their families go dry. He wants Silver Creek because whoever holds the headwater spring on that land holds the gate that decides who drinks and who does not, come August. Your husband's claim sits square on that spring." Margaret absorbed this the way she absorbed most hard news these days, without visible flinching, filing it into the growing accounting of exactly how much one man's greed had already cost her. "And you believe he had Thomas killed to keep that claim from ever being filed?" "I believe Ezra Skinner rides for him, and I believe Ezra Skinner is the only man within 2 days' ride who knew both your husband's route and my broken axle at the same hour, since he was drinking at this very station complaining of both within my hearing. I cannot prove the rest of it yet, but I mean to." "Then we had better start," Margaret said, and put her horse forward at a trot that left Cornelius Archer, for one startled moment, staring after her before he spurred to catch up. They made camp that first night on the flats below the pass, where the grass had already gone the color of old rope, and the creek beds they crossed showed more cracked mud than water. Margaret hobbled her 9 horses in a loose picket line within sight of the fire, checking each one's legs and hooves by rote before she let herself sit down to eat, a habit so old and thorough that Cornelius watched her work with a kind of quiet fascination he did not bother to hide. "You know horses," he said, when she finally settled across the low fire from him. "I know these horses. Thomas bred every one of them from stock his father kept in Missouri. There is not a rancher between here and Fort Benton who would not give a season's profit for the worst of that string." She nodded toward a rawbone bay gelding cropping grass near the picket line's end. "That one there is worth more than your stagecoach, Mr. Archer, and he knows it, which is half the trouble with him. And you are riding them alone through claim jumper country to sell them to Jasper Coyle." "I am riding them to sell them to Jasper Coyle because his money is the only money standing between me and losing that claim to whoever files first when the deadline runs out. The land office in Fort Benton will not hold a widow's intention forever, Mr. Archer. I have 90 days from the date Thomas filed his declaration to show improvement and residence on that land, and 40 of those days are already spent on the trail and in the burying." Cornelius was quiet a moment, turning a stick in the fire, watching sparks lift and die against the vast dark sky. 50 days, he said. To build something, to dig a well or plant a marker fence, to hold off a man with more money and more guns than either of us, and to keep your horses alive and fed through the hottest summer this territory has seen in a decade. 50 days, Margaret agreed. I do not intend to waste any of them feeling sorry for myself, if that is what you are working up to say next. It was not, Cornelius said, and there was something in his voice, low and rough at the edges, that made her look up from the fire and find him already looking at her, in a way that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with something else she was not yet ready to name. I was going to say that I mean to ride with you as far as that creek myself, and past it if you will let me, because a man who lets a woman ride alone into that kind of trouble twice in one season is not a man worth the name, and I have already failed your husband once by being 3 days late to a road he should never have ridden alone. Margaret studied him across the flames for a long moment, the fire throwing shifting light across a face that was, she noticed almost against her will, a good face, weathered and honest, with lines at the eyes that came from squinting into distance and not from cruelty. I did not ask you to atone for my husband's death, Mr. Archer. No, he agreed. You did not. I am offering anyway. She did not answer that directly, only banked the fire lower and told him she would take the first watch, since she slept poorly regardless and would rather be useful than restless. And if he heard the smallest note of gratitude beneath her brisk practicality, he was wise enough that first night not to say so. The trouble found them 2 days later, at a river crossing swollen not with water, for there was precious little of that left anywhere in the territory that summer, but with a snarl of driftwood and loose stone left behind by a spring flood that had since dried to a trickle threading between boulders like a wounded thing. The horses balked at the smell of something dead upstream, a deer carcass rotting in the heat, and the bay gelding Margaret had praised so highly reared hard enough to nearly unseat her, tangling 2 of the lead lines around a half-submerged log. "Cut them loose," Cornelius shouted, already off his own horse and wading in, "before that log rolls and takes a leg with it." Margaret was down and in the water before she had fully decided to be, her knife already out, sawing at the rawhide lead line while the bay screamed and thrashed and Cornelius fought to keep another 2 horses from bolting up the loose bank into a stand of rock that would have broken legs for certain. The current was not deep, barely to her knees, but it was fast where it funneled between the stones, and cold in a way that shocked her after days of relentless heat. And for one long, terrible moment she thought the log would roll before she cleared the last line, and take the gelding's leg with it exactly as Cornelius had feared. The line parted. The gelding scrambled free, trembling onto the far bank, and Margaret straightened up in the water only to find her footing gone on a moss stone, and it was Cornelius's hand, sudden and sure, that closed around her arm and hauled her upright before the current could decide the matter for her. "I had it," she said, breathless, though she made no move to pull away from his grip just yet. "I do not doubt you did," Cornelius said, and there was something rough and warm in his voice that had nothing to do with the cold water soaking them both to the skin. "I would still rather not watch you find out the hard way." They stood like that a moment longer than either of them could later have explained, the river tugging at their legs, the horses settling on both banks, the enormous sky overhead beginning to purple with evening, and then Margaret laughed, short and startled, the first real laugh Cornelius had heard out of her since the day at the station. "You have a talent, Mr. Archer, for arriving exactly when a person does not need rescuing and insisting on doing it anyway." "I have a talent," he corrected, releasing her arm slowly, as though reluctant to, "for arriving exactly when a person needs a witness to how well they manage without rescuing, and taking credit for it after." She laughed again, and this time he laughed with her, and the horses on the bank shook water from their coats and grazed as though nothing at all remarkable had happened, though something had, quiet and certain as the current still moving between the stones. They reached the flats above Prairie Wells on the 5th day, and it was there, cresting the last low ridge before the land dropped away towards Silver Creek, that they found 3 men already camped on Thomas Ramsey's claim, with a fire built too close to the old spring head and a string of picketed horses that did not belong to any honest rancher Cornelius recognized. "Vane's men," he said quietly, reining in beside Margaret at the ridge line. "That is Ezra Skinner's roan, third from the left." Margaret's hand went, out of old habit, toward a rifle that was no longer there, and found only the empty leather of a scabbard she had not yet had the sense to fill with anything else. She had a revolver in her saddlebag, Thomas's old belt pistol that she had not buried alongside the rifle, judging that a woman alone in that country needed at least one honest weapon to her name, but drawing it now, against 3 armed men on open ground, would accomplish nothing but her own quick death. "We cannot ride down there and demand they leave," she said. "No," Cornelius agreed. "But we can ride down there and let them see 2 people who are not afraid to be seen, and let Ezra Skinner wonder how much we already know." It was, Margaret thought afterward, a reckless plan dressed up as a careful one, but she found she trusted the steadiness in his voice more than she trusted her own racing pulse, and so she rode down off that ridge at his side, at an unhurried walk, toward 3 men who had every reason to want her gone from that land forever. Ezra Skinner stood up from the fire as they approached, his thin face going through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and finally a kind of oily good humor that fooled no one. "Mrs. Ramsay," he said, touching his hat brim with exaggerated courtesy, "and Mr. Archer besides. Small territory." "You are camped on private land, Skinner," Cornelius said, his voice pleasant enough on the surface, though Margaret could feel the tension coiled beneath it like a spring wound tight. "Filed land, with papers on record at Fort Benton." "Filed by a dead man," one of the other men said, a heavy-set fellow with a sunburned neck who had not bothered to stand. "Land office does not much care what a dead man filed, once his 90 days run out and nobody has built so much as a chicken coop on it." "I have 49 days left of that 90, Margaret said, meeting the heavy-set man's stare without blinking, "and I intend to spend every one of them proving up this claim, starting with informing you that you are trespassing on it right now, and asking you to be gone before dark." Skinner's smile thinned. "That is a bold thing to say to 3 men and 1 gun between the both of you, ma'am." "It is a true thing to say," Cornelius said, "which counts for more than bold in my experience, and I would remind you, Skinner, that word travels fast in this territory, and it has already traveled about a certain lie you told at Split Pass Station concerning a broken axle and a dead man's root. Mr. Boyle remembers exactly which days I was stranded there. It would not take much asking around to learn exactly which days you were not." For the first time, something like real unease crossed Ezra Skinner's face, quickly masked but not quickly enough. "I do not know what you are implying, Archer." "I am not implying anything yet," Cornelius said evenly. "I am simply telling you that a marshal rides through Prairie Wells twice a month, and questions get asked, sooner or later, of everyone standing near a dead man's wagon, and everyone who happened to know exactly where it would be." The heavy-set man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Skinner, and something unspoken passed between the 3 men camped there, a fraying at the edges of whatever confidence had brought them onto that land in the first place. It was the 3rd man, younger and quieter than the other 2, who finally broke and began kicking dirt over the fire without waiting to be told twice, muttering something about not wanting any part of a hanging matter, and within the quarter hour all 3 had mounted and ridden off toward the west, though not without Skinner turning back once to fix Cornelius, with a look that promised the matter was far from finished. "That will not hold them off for long," Margaret said, once the dust of their leaving had settled. "No," Cornelius agreed, "but it will buy us tonight, and tonight is when we start building something on this land that says a person lives here and means to keep on living here." They worked until well past dark that first night by the light of a single lantern, clearing a rough square of ground near the spring head for what would become, over the following days, a small sodden timber cabin, more shelter than home, but enough, Cornelius judged, to satisfy the improvement clause in the land office's language if a clerk ever rode out to inspect it, which in that remote country was itself no certain thing. Margaret worked beside him without complaint, her hands blistering on unfamiliar tools, her back aching in ways riding never had and found, somewhere in the second hour of hauling stone for a hearth, that she had stopped thinking of Cornelius Archer as a suspect or even as a helper, and started thinking of him, with some alarm, as someone whose company she had begun, against all her careful widow's instincts, to want. The spring itself ran clear and cold even in that terrible heat, bubbling up from some deep fold of rock beneath the meadow, and it was there, kneeling to fill their water skins on the second morning, that Cornelius showed her the old diversion gate, half buried in silt and rotted timber, that some long-departed settler had built years before to split the creek's flow between two channels. "This is what Vane wants," he said, running a hand along the weathered wood. "Whoever holds this gate decides how much water runs down to Prairie Wells for their wells and their fields, and how much stays up here for the station stock and the ranches along the pass road. Right now it is broken, stuck half open, sending too little down to the flats and too much wasted into that gully yonder. A man with money to fix it proper and no conscience about who goes thirsty could starve out either side he pleased." Margaret studied the old mechanism a long moment, her mind working the way it worked over an unfamiliar horse, looking for the shape of the problem beneath the surface trouble. "Then the answer is not to hold the gate for one side or the other," she said slowly. "It is to fix it so it serves both, on a fair turn, and let no single man's hand rest on it alone." Cornelius looked at her with an expression she was coming to recognize, equal parts respect, and something warmer he had not yet allowed himself to name aloud. "That is exactly the kind of thinking Silas Vane cannot afford to let take root on this land, Margaret." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it land somewhere low and warm in her chest, though she said nothing of it, only nodded and turned back to the water skins, telling herself it was only the heat that had brought color to her face, and knowing, even as she thought it, that it was not the heat at all. They rode into Prairie Wells 3 days later to deliver Margaret's horses to Jasper Coyle, a broad, weathered rancher whose eyes went wide and appreciative at the sight of the string coming down the last slope into town. The settlement itself was smaller than Margaret had imagined from Thomas's letters home, a single dusty street of false-fronted buildings baking under a sky gone white with heat, a mercantile, a church that doubled as schoolhouse, a smithy whose forge fire seemed almost redundant given the temperature of the air itself, and everywhere the visible strain of a community watching its wells drop day by day with no rain in the forecast and none in recent memory. "These are Ramsey horses," Jasper Coyle said, running a hand down the bay gelding's neck with the reverence of a man who knew good breeding when he saw it. "I heard tell Thomas Ramsey did not make it up from the Missouri line." "He did not," Margaret said, and something in her voice told Coyle not to press further. "I am sorry for it, ma'am. He wrote me twice about this string, and I will tell you plain his letters did not do them justice." Coyle named a price that made Cornelius's eyebrows lift slightly. More than fair. And Margaret, doing the sum in her head, understood that it would be enough, with careful management, to see her through to the end of the 90 days and beyond. Enough for lumber and nails and seed, and the small hard necessities of building a life on empty ground. It was while the sale papers were being drawn up in Coyle's front room that Margaret first heard the true shape of Prairie Wells' trouble, from Coyle's own wife, a tired, capable woman named Ruth who brought them well water so precious it was measured out by the cupful. "We have had no real rain since April," Ruth Coyle said. "The town well is down near 30 feet and dropping. Half the farms along the flats have already sold out to a land agent buying up water rights for pennies, saying he means to dig new wells and share the water fare, but nobody has seen so much as a shovel yet, and the ones who sold cannot get their land back even if they wanted to. Sela's vain, Margaret said, and Ruth Coyle's face went carefully blank in the particular way of someone who has learned not to speak a powerful man's name too loudly in his own territory. "I did not say that, ma'am." "You did not have to," Cornelia said. "But I will tell you this much, Mrs. Coyle. The spring that feeds this whole valley, above and below the pass, sits on land that belongs, by every right of law and blood, to this woman beside me, and she does not intend to starve either side of that creek to fatten Sela's Vane's purse." Word of that declaration, Margaret would learn over the following days, spread through Prairie Wells faster than the heat itself, carried on the kind of desperate hope that a dying town clings to when someone finally names the trouble everyone has been too frightened to name aloud. It also, inevitably, reached Sela's Vane himself, though Margaret would not meet the man face to face for several days yet, and when she finally did, it would not be in a parlor over sale papers, but on open ground with fire in the sky behind him. The heat broke nothing in the days that followed, only worsened, the kind of relentless dry furnace weather that old-timers in Prairie Wells said they had not seen the like of since before the war, when whole herds had died standing in dust that used to be grass. Margaret spent those days finishing the cabin's walls with lumber hauled up from Coyle's mill at a price she could just barely afford, while Cornelius, when his stage schedule allowed, rode up to help her raise the roof beam and dig, at her insistence, a second smaller well nearer the house itself, a hedge against the day the spring's flow might not reach that far. It was on one such evening, the two of them sitting on the cabin's unfinished porch step, watching the sun go down blood-red through a haze of dust that never seemed to settle, that Cornelius finally spoke of the guilt he had carried since the day he learned of Thomas Ramsey's death. "I have driven that pass road 11 years, he said, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "I know every rockfall and blind bend and dry wash on it better than I know my own face in a mirror. I have talked more than one green traveler out of riding it alone, and I did not talk your husband out of it, because I never had the chance, because I was stuck at that station with a busted axle feeling sorry for myself, instead of finding some other way to get word to him." "You could not have known," Margaret said quietly. "I could have sent a rider. I thought of it and decided against it, told myself he would be fine another day or two, that the road was quiet that season. I was wrong, and a good man is dead for it, and I do not know how a person makes peace with that kind of wrongness, Margaret, except by trying every day after to be the sort of man who would not make the same mistake twice." Margaret was quiet a long moment, watching the last color drain out of the sky. "Thomas used to say," she said finally, "that a man who never makes a wrong choice has simply never been asked to choose anything that mattered. I do not hold you responsible for his death, Cornelius. I held you responsible for one bad hour at that station because I needed somewhere to put a grief too large to carry alone, and you happened to be standing in the road when I needed to set it down. I am sorry for that hour. You do not owe me an apology for grief, Margaret Ramsey." "No," she agreed, "but I owe you the truth, which is that I do not think of you as the man who failed my husband anymore. I think of you," and here her voice caught slightly, surprising her, "as the man who has not left my side since, though nothing obliges you to stay." Cornelius turned to look at her fully then, the last light catching the line of his jaw, the careful steadiness of his eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence between them charged with something neither had yet found the courage to name. It was Cornelius who broke it, his voice rough. "I do not think I could leave your side now if you asked me to, Margaret. I have tried telling myself otherwise these past nights, and I am not much good at lying to myself, it turns out, whatever talent I have for reading a dangerous road." "I have not asked you to leave," Margaret said softly. "No," he agreed, "you have not." He did not kiss her that evening, though the wanting of it sat plain and warm between them, because Margaret Ramsey was a woman who measured her steps as carefully as she measured a horse's gait over uncertain ground, And Cornelius Archer, for all his easy confidence on a stagecoach box, found himself, in matters of the heart, willing to wait for her lead rather than take one of his own. But something had shifted between them on that porch step, quiet and irreversible as the turning of a season, and both of them felt it settle into place like a bone knitting straight. 2 days later, word reached Prairie Wells that a rider had spotted smoke rising from the dry grass along the ridge above Split Pass Station, and by the time Cornelius and Margaret reached the pass road themselves, driving hard through air gone thick and yellow with drifting ash, the whole eastern slope above the station was burning, a wall of orange fire moving fast through grass so dry it went up like paper, driven by a wind that had chosen, with cruel timing, to rise for the first time in 6 weeks precisely when no one wanted it. "If that wind holds from the east," Cornelius shouted over the roar already audible half a mile off, "it will run that fire straight down the coulee grass toward the flats, and there is nothing between here and Prairie Wells to stop it but Silver Creek." "Then we open the gate," Margaret said, already turning her horse toward the spring meadow. "We flood the old ditch line full, and wet every yard of ground it can reach before that fire gets there." They reached the meadow to find half of Prairie Wells already arriving on horseback and in wagons, having seen the smoke themselves, Jasper Coyle at the front of them with a plow hitched behind his own team, and behind him, a ragged column of men and women from the town carrying shovels, wet sacks, buckets, anything that might serve against fire. From the other direction, down off the pass itself, came a smaller group from Split Pass Station, Hiram Boyle among them, his face gray with smoke and fear for the only home he had. "We cannot save the station and the town both by fighting fire alone," Cornelius called out to the gathering crowd, standing on the wagon bed to be seen and heard over the wind. "But this creek runs between them, and if we open the old gate full and flood every foot of that ditch line, we can wet a break wide enough to stop it dead before it reaches either one." There was a moment of hesitation, the old wariness between the two settlements plain on every face, station folk who had spent years resenting the town's claims on the water, town folk who had spent years fearing the station would hoard it first in a dry season. It was Margaret who stepped into that hesitation, her voice carrying clear and steady across the meadow. "This spring belongs to my husband's claim, and I am telling you now, in front of every one of you, that no gate on this land will ever again serve one side while starving the other. Not today and not after today. But today, it saves both of you, or it saves neither, and I do not have time to argue the matter further while that fire closes the distance." Whatever doubt remained broke apart under the plain, unanswerable truth of the smoke thickening overhead. Jasper Coyle turned his plow team toward the ditch line without another word, cutting a fresh furrow to widen the old channel, and Hiram Boyle organized the station men into a bucket line from the spring head itself, while Cornelius and a dozen others worked the rotted gate mechanism with crowbars and raw strength, until the old timbers gave way all at once, and the full weight of Silver Creek's flow surged down the ditch in a rush that soaked the parched earth black within minutes. Margaret rode the length of the ditch twice, directing wet sacks to be laid across the driest gaps, her horse's hooves splashing through mud that had been dust an hour before, shouting instructions with the same calm authority she used gentling a spooked colt. And it was that authority, more than anything else said that day, that finally welded the two wary communities into a single working line against the fire's advance. The flames reached the ditch just as the last stretch of ground went dark and sodden, and there, at the edge of water where dry grass gave way to mud, the fire's advance guttered, hissed, and finally, mile by exhausted mile, began to die back on itself, starved of fuel by the very water two towns had spent a summer fighting over. It took until well past midnight before the last stubborn pockets of flame were beaten out along the ditch's edge, men and women alike blackened with soot and swaying with exhaustion. But when the sun rose the next morning, gray and strange through lingering smoke, Both split past station and Prairie Wells still stood, and the meadow between them lay scorched black on either side of a single green, wet, living ribbon of ground where the flooded ditch had held its line. It was in the midst of that exhausted, soot-streaked crowd, as the adrenaline of the long night finally began to drain out of tired limbs, that Cornelius found Margaret sitting alone on an overturned water barrel near the spring head, her hands raw and blistered, her hair come loose from its pins, watching the smoke thin against a paling sky. "You saved this valley tonight," he said, sitting down beside her without being asked. "We saved this valley tonight," Margaret corrected. "Every hand that carried a bucket or laid a wet sack saved it. I only said out loud what needed saying. That is no small thing, saying the true words at the moment folks most need to hear them." He was quiet a moment, watching her profile in the strange gray light. "Sela's vein is going to hear about tonight before the sun is much higher, Margaret. A shared gate, opened for both towns at once, with a widow standing at the center of it telling folks how it will be from now on. That is not a small threat to a man who has spent a season buying up water rights on the promise that scarcity would make him rich." "Let him hear it," Margaret said. "I am done being careful of what Sela's vein wants to hear." Cornelius reached over then, slowly, and took her raw, blistered hand in his own, turning it gently to examine the damage with a care that made her breath catch despite her exhaustion. "You will let me tend these properly once we are back at the cabin," he said, "and you will not argue with me about it for once, because a woman who has just held 2 towns together with her own 2 hands has earned the right to let someone else fuss over her for an hour." Margaret laughed, tired and warm, and did not pull her hand away. "I suppose I could allow it, just this once." There was a gathering 3 nights later, hastily arranged in the yard of Split Pass Station. Half celebration of the fire survived and half wary truce-making between the 2 communities that had, for one long desperate night, been forced to remember they shared more than they had ever admitted. Fiddles came out, and a battered accordion belonging to one of Coyle's hired men, and long tables made of planks laid across barrels groaned under whatever food both settlements could spare from their strained larders, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, laughter carried across the meadow instead of arguments over water. Margaret had not planned to dance. She had come, she told herself firmly, only to see the 2 communities settled a little further into their fragile new peace, and to wear, for one evening, a dress that was not caked in trail dust or cabin plaster, a soft blue calico she had packed away since Missouri and never expected to have occasion for again. But when the fiddle struck up something slow and warm, and Cornelius Archer crossed the lantern-lit yard toward her with his hat in his hand, and a question plain in his eyes that he did not trust himself to speak aloud, she found she had no wish at all to refuse him. "I am not much of a dancer," she warned him, as his hand settled warm and sure at her waist. "Neither am I," he admitted, "but I find I would rather step on your feet all evening than spend one more minute standing across a yard, wondering whether you would let me hold you if I asked." She laughed, and let him draw her into the slow-turning rhythm of the dance, and around them the whole gathered valley seemed to soften into something gentler than Margaret had thought that hard, dry summer still capable of producing, lantern light and fiddle music, and the smell of wood smoke fading at last from the air, replaced by cooking fires and crushed grass, and, faint but unmistakable, the smell of Cornelius Archer himself. Leather and horse and something warm beneath it that she found she wanted to lean into rather than away from. "I have been trying to find the right words for 3 weeks," Cornelius said quietly, his mouth close to her ear as they turned, "and I have decided there are none clever enough, so I will just say it plain. I love you, Margaret Ramsay. I did not intend to. I am not certain it is proper, so soon after everything you have carried this summer, and I will understand if you tell me to wait, or to say nothing more of it at all. But I could not stand here holding you, and let the evening pass without you knowing it." Margaret did not answer right away, her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion of the dance, and when she finally looked up at him, her eyes bright in the lantern light, she found she had no wish to make him wait for an answer he had already, somewhere in her chest, long since earned. "I have not said Thomas's name to anyone but his grave in 3 weeks," she said softly, "because I was afraid that if I spoke it, I would remember I was supposed to still be mourning him too fiercely to feel anything else. But I have felt something else growing in me since the day I held a rifle on you and you did not flinch, Cornelius Archer, and I am done pretending it is anything other than what it is. I love you too. It does not dishonor Thomas to say so. I think, if he could see how you have stood by me this summer, he would only be glad I was not left to face it alone." The music went on around them, and the two towns went on dancing and eating and mending. For one evening, the long habit of suspicion between them, and in the middle of it, unremarked by most of the crowd but noted with quiet satisfaction by Hiram Boyle and a wide, knowing smile from Jasper Coyle's wife, Cornelius Archer bent his head and kissed Margaret Ramsay for the first time, gentle and certain. While the fiddle played on, and the last of the summer's smoke drifted away at last on a wind that had finally, blessedly, gone still. The peace did not last unchallenged, for Silas Vane was not a man to surrender a season's careful scheming, simply because a fire had burned through the middle of it. He rode into Prairie Wells himself 4 days after the dance, a lean, silver-haired man in a coat too fine for the dust of that country, and demanded, before the whole gathered town, that the water rights papers he claimed to have purchased from a dozen desperate farmers that summer be honored in full, regardless of any shared arrangement Margaret Ramsay had declared over the old diversion gate. Margaret met him on the church steps, Cornelius at her side, and Ezra Skinner, notably, was nowhere among the small knot of hired men Vane had brought with him, having, it would later emerge, quietly ridden east out of the territory 2 nights before, unwilling to stand trial for a murder his employer had ordered and he himself had helped conceal. "Those papers were bought under false promise, Mr. Vane," Margaret said, "with farmers told you meant to dig new wells and share water fair, when in truth you meant to starve out any claim that stood between you and the spring itself. That is fraud, and there is a marshal in Fort Benton who will be very interested to hear the particulars, along with certain questions about a stagecoach robbery on the Ashcroft grade this past June that left a settler dead and his widow blamed on a lie." Vane's composure did not crack easily, but something flickered behind his pale eyes at the mention of the marshal, and behind him, in the small gathered crowd of Prairie Wells residents who had sold to him in desperation and now stood watching with dawning fury, murmurs began to rise. "I have men who will testify Ezra Skinner acted alone, without my knowledge," Vane said smoothly. "You may find that harder to arrange," Cornelius said, "now that Skinner has run rather than stay and share whatever punishment you intended to leave him holding alone. A guilty man who runs does not usually run toward the arms of the fellow he is protecting, Mr. Vane. He runs away from him." It was Jasper Coyle who stepped forward then, his broad face set hard, holding up a bundle of papers of his own. "I rode to Fort Benton myself 3 days past, Vane, the morning after that fire, and filed a complaint with the land office concerning fraudulent water rights purchases in this county. The registrar there is already sending a deputy marshal to look into the matter. You would do well to be gone from Prairie Wells before he arrives, and to leave every acre you bought under false pretense to be returned to the families who sold it, or answer for it in a courtroom instead of a church yard." The crowd's murmur rose to something closer to a roar of agreement, and Silas Vane, for the first time in a long career of quiet, moneyed intimidation, found himself facing a community that had stopped being afraid of him, stitched together not by his money but against it, by a widow's stubborn courage and a stagecoach driver's steady loyalty, and a fire that had taught 2 feuding settlements exactly how much they needed each other. He left Prairie Wells within the hour, and word would reach the valley some weeks later that a federal marshal had indeed made the long ride out from Fort Benton, that fraudulent land purchases across 3 counties were being unwound one deed at a time, and that Silas Vane himself faced charges serious enough to keep him occupied in courtrooms far from Montana territory for a good long while to come. The land office in Fort Benton confirmed Margaret's claim in full within the month, the improvement clause satisfied by the cabin, the well, and not least, by the sworn testimony of half of Prairie Wells and Split Pass Station both, who had watched her stand at the center of a firefight for their shared water, and would not have tolerated any clerk's objection to her right to the land she had bled and sweated to hold. When the news came that Jasper Coyle, in his role as an informal spokesman for the valley's grateful settlements, had gathered a purse of nearly $400, collected from both towns as thanks for the night the fire had been turned back, and wished to present it to Margaret and Cornelius as a reward for their part in saving the valley, Margaret refused it before he had finished the sentence. "That money belongs to the valley, not to us," she said, standing on the same church steps where she had faced down Silas Vane weeks before, this time with a very different crowd gathered before her, warm with gratitude rather than fear. "I would ask instead that it be put toward digging a proper community well here in Prairie Wells, deep enough to see through a summer like this one without every family watching the water drop day by day, and toward repairing the old gate on Silver Creek so it need never again depend on rotted timber and a widow's stubbornness to hold." Cornelius, standing beside her, added his own piece without hesitation, having discussed it with her at length in the quiet of the cabin porch the night before. "And I would ask that whatever remains go toward a schoolhouse bell and books for the children of both settlements, since it seems to me a valley that can learn to share water in a drought might as well learn its letters together too." The crowd's response was warm enough that Margaret found herself, not for the first time that strange, hard, blessed summer, blinking back tears she had not expected, and it was Ruth Coyle who finally voiced what half of Prairie Wells was already thinking. "You two are going to marry, are you not?" she said, not quite a question, and the crowd's laughter, gentle and knowing, was answer enough even before Cornelius, grinning in a way Margaret had rarely seen on his careful, steady face, took her hand in front of the whole gathered valley and said that he intended to ask her properly that very evening if she would permit him, and would be much obliged if the town would kindly mind its own business until he had. That evening, on the same porch step where he had first spoken his guilt aloud, and she had first admitted she no longer blamed him for it, Cornelius Archer asked Margaret Ramsay to marry him, plainly and without ceremony, exactly as she would have wanted it, and she said yes before he had even finished the question, laughing through the same tears she had held back on the church steps, because there was nothing left in her that summer that needed holding back any longer. They were married in September, once the heat had finally broken, and the first thin rains had begun to soften the cracked earth of the flats, in a small ceremony at the Prairie Wells Church attended by both settlements together, Hiram Boyle standing as witness alongside Jasper Coyle, the diversion gate on Silver Creek repaired and running clear and shared between both communities on a fair rotation that neither side had needed a lawman or a lawsuit to enforce. Only the memory of a night they had fought a fire together and won. Margaret kept the cabin on Thomas Ramsay's claim, and it became, over the following months, the true center of the valley, a place where Cornelius, who gave up the long, lonely runs over Ashcroft Pass in favor of a shorter route that let him ride home most every evening, would return each night to find her at the corral fence or the garden she had coaxed, against all that summer's odds, into bearing a late harvest of beans and squash from soil that had once seemed too scorched to hold anything living at all. On the anniversary of that terrible ambush, in the following June, Margaret rode out alone to Thomas's grave one last time, not out of unfinished grief, but out of a quieter need to close the circle properly, and found the little rise green now with grass that had grown back thick and unbothered over the raw earth, the wooden cross weathered pale but still standing straight, the rifle resting undisturbed beneath the soil where she had laid it a year before. "We held it, Thomas," she said, "kneeling in grass instead of dust this time. The land and the water and something more besides that I did not think I would find again so soon, though I believe you would not begrudge me the finding of it. I hope, wherever you have gone, that you can see it now, the land you crossed a continent for and never got to see with your own eyes. It is good land, Thomas. It is good land, and it is shared, and it is loved, and I mean to keep it that way for the rest of my life." She rode back to the cabin as the sun began its long golden descent toward the mountains, and found Cornelius waiting for her on the porch step exactly as he always did, rising to meet her at the gate with the easy, unhurried certainty of a man who had found, at last, the one road in all that hard, beautiful territory that he never wanted to leave. And Margaret Ramsay, who had once held a rifle on that same man out of grief and a convincing lie, dismounted into his waiting arms and let herself, fully and without reservation, be home.